Greetings, everybody. Now that I've got my new toy, a new gimbal, call this a test drive, an introduction to what I have tentatively called the new Maroon Getaway Podcast / vlog. And I've termed this or called this Life Examined by an Aspiring 21st Century Maroon. Life Examined by an Aspiring 21st Century Maroon. What exactly does that mean? Because I'd like to know what that means myself. And I'm sure anybody hearing that for the first time, even hearing the term maroon for the first time, would like to get some explanation as to what that means. And I think, conceptually, it's an interesting idea. Marronage. Maroons were they were slaves that had run away or left the plantations in which they were being used to work. They, I guess in those days they would have said that these were people that suffered from this curious illness that was at first identified by Samuel Cartwright. Someone who was called a doctor, and he had diagnosed a problem, or termed a problem that he had diagnosed in slaves, called drapetomania. This was this urge, this mania, this craziness that had overcome slaves, that had driven them to want to run away, to somehow try to escape or remove themselves from this, from this situation in which they had to work for nothing, and have to put up with or endure whatever it was that they were made to endure in the course of doing this work. So, in the course of running away, these folks had seen fit to try to find a place that they could live as free people. And in attempting to try to live as free people, this often entailed not running off, at least if you're for example, if you're in America, if you're in the South, running to the North. In the North, it's not exactly, it wasn't exactly a paradise there either. It wasn't as though the kind of freedom that I think everybody else would attempt to aspire to would be found for these people in that place either. So what they did was they often ran off into areas where they could not be found, or at least it would be very difficult to find them. These were what some people would call the hinterlands, or sort of the wildernesses, the wastelands, swamps. It's very hard to get to, hard to access places. In areas where Maroons are more commonly known to have been, which would have included places like Brazil or Jamaica. I guess you can say Haiti, but the entire country, the entire nation, was more or less a Maroon refuge, being that it was a place where there was a slave rebellion. They went by many names. These areas that Maroons had gone to, they were known as palenques, or Columbos, I should say, Mocambos, or Cumbes, or Ladieras, or Mambizes. Some of those pronunciations might not be correct, but these were the areas that were, these ended up becoming refuges. They ended up becoming communities. Some of them had thousands of members. Some of them have actually lasted for centuries. But these were the areas that they had created for themselves, for their families, and for their loved ones to live a life where they weren't made to work as somebody's property, or where they weren't made to work to enrich other people. And I think the interesting thing about the whole concept of marronage is that it was it wasn't as though they were trying to become part of somebody else's society, where it was either live on the plantation or escape to another part of the country where they didn't necessarily have the plantation, but they weren't necessarily seen as being equal members of that society either. So, being that these were folks who were in hard to access places in and among nature, it required them to have a very good working knowledge of their surroundings, and they also had to possess the capability of being able to do for themselves, based on what those surroundings had afforded them the opportunity to access, so they can create a life for themselves. So it presented some very interesting possibilities. If you now have the ability to be able to live your life in your terms. So conceptually, I think that's it's a very attractive idea. What that would look like in the 21st century, as opposed to what it may have looked like in the 18th and 19th century, or 20th century. I think it's an interesting idea to investigate, to try to imagine. I think that the dynamics of the time, I think, would make it very difficult to do some of the things that these people or those communities ended up being able to create. I think the nature of governance, the nature of how wealth works, systems of control, surveillance, the ability to be able to keep tabs on people and keep tabs on space, I think really forces one to have to not nostalgize about what may have happened then, and attempt to try to sort of replicate lock, stock, and barrel, wholesale what those folks were able to accomplish, because frankly I think as a practical matter that that's not necessarily happening. But as an idea, being able to take the idea and somehow translate it to our time, I think is something that is worth doing. It's entertaining the possibility that there can be a variation on the theme that maybe one can approximate. Is I think it's something worth investigating. But I think what's probably what's interesting to do to try to kind of step back and examine is what gave birth to these systems in the first place. What gave birth to the plantation system. What gave birth to this idea that it was necessary to do the kinds of things to the people who were put into this position where they found it necessary to take these measures to extricate themselves from this bondage. I mean, many would probably, many have made the argument that we have simply another variation on that theme now. You don't necessarily have chattel slavery, but there's wage slavery. The idea that, again, the ability to determine for oneself how one has seen fit to create a life that meets their needs, that covers their essentials, that doesn't necessitate that they humiliate themselves. How did what are the conditions, what are the dynamics that even made that whole thing possible, or again, something that was seen as being a thing to do? I think it's very interesting. I found a quote the other day that I think sort of speaks to that. And it came out of this book here, which is very quickly becoming one of my favorite things ever. So this is Against the Grain, James C. Scott, A Deep History of the Earliest States. And there's a great quote that he cites in the latter part of his book, and it says to be governed is to be at every operation, at every transaction, noted, registered, counted, taxed, stamped, measured, numbered, assessed, licensed, authorized, admonished, prevented, reformed, corrected, punished. This is from a Pierre Joseph Proudhon. And I think the point is that isn't to challenge the idea that there shouldn't be any governance. There shouldn't be anything in place to dictate to folks what should or shouldn't be done. I think the question we got to figure out, the question I think everyone would do well to ask themselves is, by what or by whom are you being governed, and to what end, to what ultimate purpose? What are you being expected to invest yourself into? And once you've invested yourself into that thing, what do you get out of it? And at the end of the day, there's a transaction that's taking place, there's an exchange. Whatever it is that you have to give up for what you're being offered, is it worth whatever it is that you gave up? And I think that there are a number of things that are involved in figuring that out. So yeah, I mean, this is I think lots of folks have different ideas as to as to how you answer that, if there is an answer. And obviously, all the different criteria for what we see as being worthwhile. But this is a life examined. This is an attempt to try to be conscious of what it is that we're doing and how it is that we're doing it, and what are the outcomes of the things that we do. And that the things that I think are being offered to us in an effort to sort of lull us to sleep and not examining those things and not asking these questions and not taking the time to see whether or not there's another way that things can be done. This isn't that's not the outcome of that is not benign. So then this should be interesting again. Hopefully, again, this is an exchange. Folks will be able to learn, in the course of going through this. So I'm looking forward to what comes out of it, if anything. And I think also something else that will be a part of the series is I'll keep you up to speed on some of the work that I'm involved with, and some of the projects that may be coming up that might be of interest to some of y'all. Excuse the change in light, but I wanted to get that in. Oh. So we'll be back at you. Hopefully I'll get used to using this thing a bit more. A new toy. And yeah. In the meantime, behave yourself, and talk again soon enough.